of faith, came the opportunity to remind them and other hearers. Jesus reminds them of the substance of their faith. Not a formula, not a right answer, but the substance of their faith. And it's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. It's found in Deuteronomy, actually. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment of all? He answered with the Shema, the substance of their faith. Well, not exactly. Matthew's Jesus answers, you shall love the Lord your God in your whole heart, in your whole life, and in your whole mind. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Little different version, though it's all there in Hebrew scripture. So in other words, in this hostile environment where they're testing him and he's speaking of the substance of faith, if there's a formula, it's 1 + 1 = 1. The greatest commandment is actually 2, and they are intimately tied together, inseparable. In other words, Jesus links the command to love God with loving one's neighbor, with loving the other. And they are inseparable. One measures his or her love for God by his or her loving attitude or posture toward the neighbors, and vice versa. Loving one's neighbor genuinely is a sign and an experience of the divine. This is not a gushy, well, I have to feel good about everybody kind of thing. It's love that does include anger, grief, saying no, discipline, and sometimes, probably especially now, distance. It is love that means being conscious in God, praying to follow God's way and knowing no satisfaction apart from that. It's a devotion to God that results in being able to offer for God's glory even the tedious moments of life, as well as the joyful ones and the sad ones. It's a love that nourishes one's identity as a co-creator with God, rather than the worship of God in the image of kind of that big eye in the sky that can hardly wait to find something wrong with us. Or like Monty Python so famously did, saw God as a giant foot that will stomp down on whatever fun we're having that day. The love that we know in God and the love that we are to manifest to the world is rarely sweet. It is instead a powerful force for transformation, for justice in our communities and our communities of faith, in our state, our province, in the world. Loving one's neighbor is a posture in life that seeks God's shalom for another, that seeks the will of God for another. It does not require that we take abuse. Let me be clear about that. It does not require that we take abuse from another, but it does require that we not indulge in abusive behavior in return. One of my dear and favorite professors, who was really a tough teacher, put it this way. He's the Professor Herman Waitchen from the San Francisco Theological Seminary, long retired now. Herman writes, "The integrity of the human being's love The integrity of the human being's love is what is required. What's the greatest commandment? Well, it's two. Love God with your whole being and love your neighbor. Actually, the two might actually be three. It appears that the one great commandment has two components. To love God with your whole being is to also love your neighbor as yourself. Loving oneself is the kind of love that is to have the same integrity as our love of God and neighbor. Really? How do we do that? Well, it's not self-indulgence any more than accepting abuse from another is loving that other. To love self is to be conscious of the fact that we are made in the image of God, that we ourselves are co-creators with God. To remember that nothing can separate us from the love of God because God has claimed us. Loving oneself is a posture or a way of living that seeks the will of God in our lives, that seeks to be who God made us to be. And it is never too late. It is never too late to adopt this posture in life. It is our calling every day to live into it. This posture of love, devotion to the Creator, seeking and investing in God's shalom for another, and claiming that wellness for oneself, isn't a formula. Let me be clear. It's not a formula. It's not just a cerebral exercise. It is the substance of our faith. It is the measure of our faith, not just for individuals, but also for communities of faith. This great 3-in-1 commandment has been the substance of faith since it first began to be uttered. This command is uttered throughout our scripture and often, as it was for Jesus, in hostile environments, in the wilderness, in all of this distancing, in the form of tests given by those seeking to ensnare. We know that those who are to be holding this posture of love, if we're really honest, we have to admit, those of us who are supposed to be holding this posture of love can often be the ones who are testing others. We are sometimes the ones who create the hostile environments in which this love is trying to take root. We know that sometimes the church can be a hostile environment for the gospel, for God's good news that experiencing and living such love are truly possible. Today's lesson speaks to us of what is possible, even and perhaps especially in hostile times and hostile environments. Today's lesson calls us to raise ourselves up into the posture of love that is required of us as people of faith, and that is possible for us as people of faith. I know this because I have already seen it in you, even through a Zoom lens. I've seen it in you. When we do raise ourselves up as a truly faithful church, then we will begin to transform our political and theological agendas away from win-lose to win-win. Good grief, we all know in the province of BC, some are celebrating today and some are lamenting. Stewardship campaigns will become things of the past because we will no longer accept the lie that there is not enough to go around. And we will see that we have been given all that we need to do God's mission, and each will give according to ability and according to God's will. We will build communities where wellness is the posture, the priority, preventative care, something other than a luxury. We'll learn to fight fair. Our leadership will be smart and wise. Our leaders will be encouraged to, instead of working themselves to death, take prayer and study time for the purpose of growing in spirit and in truth, and, reading those texts and struggling with the hard ones. I think when we adopt the posture of love, we laugh more. We lighten up and we focus more on what we can accomplish together rather than drawing lines in the sand over our differences. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that living this love is easy or painless. Hardly. It is through pain that through pain can come power to create rather than destroy. That's not why we're given pain, by the way. This is not cause and effect. But out of pain, given our posture in life, we can find something to create out of that rather than to let that pain destroy. It is complexity that reveals the many textures of God's goodness. The good news of this story is that this reminder of the substance of our faith was given in a hostile environment of the faithful. It would be a misrepresentation of this passage if we read it as Jesus against Jews. That's not what this was about. It's for our purposes, about the church, about those who are convinced that they are faithful above everyone else and end up destroying community rather than building it up. And we see that around us. I mean, I'm so grateful to be with both of you communities of faith where that is not present. It's a picture of the divine response to children of God who can be hostile and fearful in the face of God's creative intentions. It's a reminder, this passage, for us to adopt the divine posture towards life, especially when we feel under siege from destructive forces. The truth is that God intends life and has done so from the beginning, abundant life for each one and for each community. That abundance is revealed when we claim a posture of divine love, especially in the face of challenge and hostility. To live this posture is to know ourselves as one with God, and we can know that, and we do know that. It is to recreate our church, and it is to receive a peace that passes all understanding. It is to receive the peace that passes all understanding. I'm going to ask Greg to bring some pictures up because I was thinking about this through the context of work this week with the General Council of the United Church of Canada. We had our general meeting, all via Zoom, over 300 people, and you can see, that's what my workspace looks like at home. So you can see up top, screens full of people and a computer with agendas and work to be done. And so here we were, a community of people trying to hold the posture of loving one's neighbor as oneself as the predominant piece of work that we did was to adopt not just a statement, but a strategy for taking on the posture of love by becoming an anti-racist church. And those documents will be made available, and we'll talk some more about that in the future. Right? It was very much about how do we love neighbors as selves. To do so means we must now do this work. What you also see is a photograph of this beautiful man by the name of Michael Blair. Nora Sanders, who has been for many years the executive secretary of the General Council, retires in November. And we heard from her about what it's been like for her to do this work with communities of faith from all across the country. From going through massive structural changes, working with conferences and presbyteries, to working with regions and working with our global partners at the same time. And so we blessed Nora. We gave thanks for her good and faithful service. And we welcomed Michael, and we covenanted with Michael Blair, who you see on the screen, who will be our new executive secretary beginning in November. Michael has been on the General Council staff, knows the work of the national church, is well acquainted with communities of faith, and will continue this good work. If I can have the next slide. And this is the last part of our statement in covenanting with Michael, where it says, we promise to work beside one another and with our General Secretary, Michael, as we share in the ministry of Jesus on behalf of the whole church, and to remember each other in our prayers. May God strengthen us to support and encourage each other in all we do. One more expression of a national body trying to love God and love neighbor as self, and doing it together. May God bless us from our communities of faith all the way through to the General Council, that we might be God's goodness in the world, that God's just peace will be experienced by more as a result of our acts of faithfulness.